guest this week on Veterans Chronicles is Florida Congressman Brian Mast. He's also a veteran of the U.S. Army who served in Afghanistan with a focus on explosive ordnance disposal. It's a job during which he was very badly wounded. For his service, Brian was awarded the Bronze Star, among many other honors. He medically retired from the service in 2012 and was elected to Congress from Florida in 2016. Sir, thanks very much for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
Where were you born and raised?
I was born and raised in Grand Rapids, Michigan. Great place.
And your dad was a Korean War vet, and so did that inspire your desire to join the service?
You know, my father served during Korea. He didn't go over. He fought what he called, he would quip sometimes, the Battle of the Great Lakes. He was part of a battalion that was out of Great Lakes, Chicago, and they never went anywhere. They stuck around there. But I was happy to follow in his footsteps and serve.
What made the decision for you when you joined?
I always knew I wanted to go in. It was something that I knew at a very young age. I think I just looked at it and saw that it was the place for me. And when I got there, it really was the place for me. I fit right in. It was just, it made sense to me.
So you joined in 2000, so just a year before 9/11.
I did.
What was that like for you, and what did it help you realize might be coming for you?
You know, I enlisted just before 9/11, and then obviously those events transpired, and shortly thereafter, you know, things started moving from my unit, and it was a very interesting time, you know, to see your nation attacked through the lens of being in the military and knowing that you're going to have to go out there and now, you know, actually defend your country, do what you've trained to do throughout that piece that you've decided was going to be your life. It was a little bit of a surreal time, but it really showed that I had made the right decision. And I was placed in the place that I was meant to be. And as you move on down the road, I always tell people, you know, there's never a day that I would trade 2 legs and a finger for any one of my friends. I was in the right place at the right time, despite everything that transpired.
Immediately after 9/11, what did that mean for your assignments? Did that change much, where you got assigned, where you were training?
So I started my career, I was in university, this is right after high school. I started my career in the reserves, and 9/11 occurred, and then that reserve unit that I was a part of got called up, and we went away for a year, and then after getting back from that, you know, basically transitioned to active duty military, and ended up spending the rest of my adult life as active duty military. And when I was in the reserves, I was a combat engineer. And when you're being a combat engineer, you do a little bit of work with explosives and cratering and landmines and things like that. And I had a really good propensity for it. I enjoyed it and I understood it, and that's where I decided I wanted to become a bomb technician, a much more advanced version of that. And so that's where I really had the opportunity to become an expert in the chemistry of explosives and the physics of blast effects. And then, of course, the other side of it is you have to be willing to stand on top of an explosive device and say it's either going to be you or it's going to be me. You know, we have a motto as bomb technicians: it's initial success or total failure. And I think that puts it into perspective. It's absolutely the truth. You get it right or you get it wrong.
What was the training like for that?
It was intense. You know, training to become a bomb technician, I think it's a really interesting dynamic of training. A lot of times you can do something that's very academically intensive, and sometimes you can do things that are very mechanically intensive. And this is one of those places that you have to be able to do both and combine very high physical abilities on top of that. But you have to be one that can open up books, understand physics, understand, you know, advanced math and chemistry, and be able to do things with fuels and oxidizers. But at the same time, you have to be somebody that can also open up the hood of a car and be able to turn a wrench and make things work there. And you have to marry all of that together to be a successful bomb technician.
So I'm sure you felt like you were ready. What was it like when you got to Afghanistan and you dealt with them for real? It was
being able to just do my job. It's what I had trained for. I had the opportunity to do that in our highest level of special operations, so it was a little bit different application of the work from many folks that do the job. Where I was at, being a bomb technician was not the sole mission. I was in a place where we were always going after, on a nightly basis, we only worked at night, after very high value targets. Those high value targets were the mission. And so my job as the bomb technician was to make sure that we could get around or mitigate any explosive hazards, and that we could do that safely. And then there was other things that we layered on top of that. But that didn't mean that we were getting rid of every explosive device on the battlefield like many of my bomb tech peers. And in that work, I didn't get to carry around a 100-pound bomb suit or a 100-pound robot on top of my 25 pounds of body armor, my 8-pound rifle, my 10 magazines of 20 rounds apiece, my 4-pound helmet, the night vision optics that were on top of that, the 30, 40 pounds of explosives that I would carry on my back, the pistol that I would carry, the magazines for that, the metal detector I would carry, the water weighs 8.3 pounds a gallon, and everything else. So you're very heavy. I couldn't carry that other stuff, which meant I had to do the job with my hands.
And with improvised explosive devices, did you find that a lot of them had the same methodology, or was everyone completely, just a different assignment?
When you're talking about improvised explosive devices, or IEDs as they're so commonly called, the genius to them, or the real imagination to them, is how you get somebody to set something off without them knowing it. That's the imagination of the bomber, and that's where it becomes this one-on-one battle between the person trying to disarm the device and the person that created the device. And that's where you have to work through it and say, is this a pressure plate that's designed to be stepped on? Is it something that when you move it, that causes it to go off? Is it something that is connected to a tripwire, that if you pull the tripwire it goes off, or if you cut the tripwire it goes off? There could be 100 different ways for how you get a device to go off, and that's where the creativity of bomb technicians really comes in, and being able to figure that out and hopefully advance beyond what the maker designed.
So how did you approach it? What kind of checklist did you go through in your mind? If you move it, if I pick it up, if I step on it, any of those.
Very good threat assessment. When we go through our training, some of the stuff that we do is we would go through very exhaustive physical training. You'd have all that gear on that I already mentioned, and you'd run and you'd jump over obstacles, and you'd get around for 15, 20 minutes, and then they would put a device in front of you, and with your heart rate going 1,000,000 miles a minute, you're expected to try to sit there and figure out, how does this device work? Maybe under night vision optics, where you don't have a flashlight and everything looks a little bit different, and then actually disarm that and not necessarily have an x-ray machine or other things like that to go out there and help you do it. It can be a very challenging task to undertake, but the training that we do, that I can't get into completely, really, it prepares us very well.
And then what we haven't described yet is that sometimes you're doing this while you're under fire, right?
Yeah, it can very often be the case that when you're trying to disarm devices, that there can be enemies shooting at you, that there can be other improvised explosive devices that are in the area. The reality when it comes to IEDs is that they don't just come in ones or twos. Again, it's up to the imagination of the bombers. So if they want to put out a dozen or 2 dozen improvised explosive devices, you can do that, and you can literally find yourself into what you could consider a makeshift minefield, and they could all function differently. And these are some of the things that we've literally seen played out on the battlefield.
So let's talk about September 2010. How did that day unfold for you?
Well, I was injured September 19th, 2010. I remember it very, very vividly. It was as I tell people, because I get asked about it often, and I don't mind speaking about it. I think it's important for us to share these, pieces of history that every veteran has inside of them, to help people understand what is the makeup of the battlefield and how does it really look. And I tell them, that was a very normal night for the assault force that I was a part of. We were headed out looking for one of these high-value targets. Part of that mission involved taking over an area, and normally we wouldn't stay during the daytime. We would try to get in at night, and we'd try to get off the ground at night. But some of these missions we would do, we would go in, we would take over a compound, we would hoist up an American flag on a makeshift flagpole so that everybody would know that we were there. And some of the bad people that we knew lived in those compounds, we would release a couple of them and say, hey, go tell your dirtbag friends that we're here. And inevitably, they would come out for a fight, and we would spend the next period of time, 24, 48 hours, just in what we call a TIC, troops in combat, and just engaging that enemy. And that was the kind of mission that we were on that night. As we were infilling to that mission, we came to a spot that I was pretty much guaranteeing my men that there was an IED somewhere on the battlefield there. I said, look, if I was a bomber, this is exactly where I would put one. And I did everything that I could to look for them. I had a laser on the front of my rifle. Sometimes I would put that laser out and try to look for tripwires. At one point I was down on my hands and knees with a small handheld metal detector, probing the ground, looking for signs of metallic signatures, doing a lot of other things. And I didn't find or see anything. And eventually I was working with these two snipers that were behind me. I gave them the signal that I was going to forge ahead. And when I did that, I took 1, 2, maybe 3 steps past that area that I had just examined and searched, and I found the device that I thought was there. I stepped on it in all likelihood. I remember it tumbling me through the air. I remember landing on my back. I remember very well the wind being knocked out of me. It reminded me of, one time when I was a little kid and I fell out of a tree, and I can remember, gasping for air because the wind had been knocked out of me from the concussion of that explosion. And I realized also that I couldn't stand up, but I didn't know why. I had all that weight of that body armor on me, and I couldn't even sit up. And so at a certain point, my medics, who were very good medics, I still talk to some of them to this day, they got to me. And that speaks a little bit to just how brave they are, because they went racing into an area where they didn't know if there was more than one explosive device there. They didn't know if there was 5 more or 0 or however many, and they raced in to try to save my life, and they did. And in order to do that, they had to put tourniquets on each one of my legs and a tourniquet on my left arm. That was probably one of the most painful things physically I could ever remember, was them ratcheting those tourniquets down as tight as they could to keep me from hemorrhaging out. And what really brought it home for me was, as I'm sitting there listening, I still had my commo device in my ear, and I could hear them radioing things up to headquarters, to our talks, saying, EOD is hit, EOD is down, and they're talking about this, and I can hear all this playing out in my ear, and it made it very surreal. Eventually, they got me onto a stretcher, and that was also one of the things that I remember very vividly, because of how different it was compared to what is normal about life. Most of us, we walk through life vertically on our feet, and we see the world go by in that way. And here I was, for the first time in my life, I'm laid on my back on this stretcher, and I'm strapped down to it. And there was a pretty good illumination from the moon that night. And so I'm looking up into the sky, and I'm seeing the moon and the stars go by, and I'm being carried in this very jostled way that 4 men, each on one corner of the stretcher, carry you across the rough terrain of the battlefield. And at one point they're trying to go through a river and up and down other things. It was a very surreal way to be carried across the ground. And eventually they got me to the medevac helicopter. And if you've ever been around a helicopter, you know all the stuff that it kicks up into the air. And so on this horizontal surface that all of this dust and hay and dirt is landing on. And they loaded me onto the helicopter, and they gave me one last salute, and they told me that I would be okay. And that's the last memory that I have from that night, and really until I woke up a couple days later in Walter Reed Army Medical Center.
So you came straight back here, you didn't stop at Germany?
I know there was a couple stops along the way, going between, I was injured somewhere close to Kandahar, Afghanistan. I'm told I stopped in Bagram, I'm told I stopped in Landstuhl, Germany, and I don't have any memories of those times, but there are people that tell me they came to visit me as I was going through there, and we were very jovial and we were talking. I don't have any memories of it. One of the things that happened to me when I was in Landstuhl, Germany, which was a very important piece of my life, was there was an Army medic that was in Germany at the time. His name was Josh, and he was a guy that I went to school with, middle school with, high school with. I didn't know he was in the military. I have no idea if he knew I was in the military. But at a certain point, he found me there and sees, okay, it's Brian Mast, this guy I went to school with. He reaches out back home to where my family is, gets in contact with my wife, and my family isn't able to tell them everything that's going on with me. And ultimately, he asked my wife to email him a photo of her and our son at that time. We only had one son. He was 6 months old. And he blew that picture up, printed it out, and enlarged it and taped it to the end of my hospital gurney. That flat plastic part, where my feet would have normally been sticking up, but they weren't. And so that was kind of, again, one of those parts that I tell people often. I think, life is well beyond coincidence.
Wow. So your surgery happened right away then?
I know there was a number of surgeries. I don't remember all of them. I know there was surgery in Kandahar, surgery in Bagram, surgery in Germany, surgery back when I got to the United States of America. I had not long ago, I went and spoke. I was invited to go speak at they called it an extremity war injury conference, and there was a number of doctors there. And when I got in there, and after I got done speaking, there was about 5 doctors that walked up to me. And again, I didn't know they were going to be there, and they didn't know I wasn't going to be there. But they were doctors that had conducted surgery on me throughout all of those places, from Afghanistan, Germany, all the way back to the United States of America, that I hadn't seen or thought of since that time. You know, orthopedic surgeons that worked on my hands or worked on my legs, and you know, those that were doing you know, every other piece of surgery that I needed. And again, that was just one of those interesting moments to kind of help bring closure to the entire experience.
What was it like coming to grips with what the rest of your life would be like? I'm sure you're grateful to be alive, but dealing with that, and also I know that your dad gave you some very valuable advice at that point.
Yeah, I received a lot of good advice. You know, coming to grips with it was probably one of the most difficult parts. My wife and I, we were, maybe this seems silly, we were very prepared for the idea that I may not come home. That's the reality of being a bomb technician. And any given day, whether you're working in the United States or whether you're working abroad, you get it right or you get it wrong. And if you get it wrong, you're probably going to die. So we were very prepared for the idea that I may not come home. Her and I never, ever considered that I might come home differently. It's just something that we never played out. And so when I woke up in the hospital, I had 2 different things that were playing out in my mind. So first of all, I had in my mind, and sometimes I'm almost embarrassed to say it because I think I must have sounded so naive when I said this. I literally thought, you know, I'm going to do a couple weeks of physical, I'm going to slap on a pair of prosthetics, I'm going to do a couple weeks of physical therapy, and I'm going to be back out on the next rotation to Afghanistan. And that drove me. It was something that drove me to push myself as hard as I could as I was going through physical therapy. But at the same time, I also knew, I think, deep down, that I was never going to be an asset to the mission again in the same way that I was. I was never going to return to the battlefield in the same capacity that I was there before. And that was the most difficult thing for me to overcome. It wasn't anything physical. It was that I thought I had lost my purpose in life. And that's where, you know, one of the things that my father, you know, told me, probably the most important thing that he ever told me in his life that he'll ever tell me. And when he came to my bedside the very first time, he's standing next to me, and I always tell people, you know, my dad and I, we love each other, but we've never been those 2 guys that go around saying that we love each other. It's just not who he and I happen to be as men. And so he came to my bedside, and he was tearful, he was emotional, and he told me that he loved me, which, like I said, so that was, you know, just a little bit different, number one. And then it went back to this tough love that, you know, that the relationship that we had. And he said to me very seriously, he said, you can't let this keep you down. You got to find a way to get out there, to pull yourself up, to get back to work. And he really brought it home by saying this. He said, you can't let your kids see you sitting on your butt regardless of whatever happens to you in life, because your kids will think it's an okay way for them to go through their life because they're always watching you. And that really brought it home for me to say, you know, yeah, you got to pull yourself up. You got to get back out there. And that was part of the catalyst, all of those things playing out together, that first really implanted in my mind the idea of running for Congress one day, because I was battling with, how do I regain my purpose in life? How do I get back into the fight? That was my purpose, fighting for this country. And so I'm battling with the ideas of how do I get back to that. And that's where I thought, well, maybe my next battlefield would be Washington, D.C., and it'd be as a member of Congress. And now I get to do that.
It certainly is. Let's talk about a couple of steps in between there. You decided to use your skills to assist the Department of Homeland Security in a private sector, well, maybe public kind of way. Explain what role you had with them in terms of explosives.
So, like I said, you know, I spent my career as a bomb technician, and luckily, that's a skill that's very needed in the world today. Maybe not luckily, but it is a skill that's very needed in the world today, whether you're in local law enforcement or pretty much any federal agency that we have. And I worked with several of our federal agencies. I had the opportunity to help teach classes with the ATF on homemade explosives and post-blast analysis, and I had the opportunity to work with the National Nuclear security administration, on counterproliferation efforts and things like that. And ultimately, the day that I pretty much retired from the military was the day that I went to work under the Department of Homeland Security as, again, very similar bomb technician work. They called me an explosive specialist. And that work was allowing me to use that creativity that I talked about, that you're trying to figure out what can a bomber create. And a lot of my work was creating devices out of anything that I could think of, and I can't talk about what those are because then somebody might try to mimic those devices, but literally take anything in the world and make some kind of device out of it and try to surreptitiously move that through some of our layers of security, and then afterwards train the people to say, see, these are things that you could have looked for, this is where you could tell that there was an explosive here, and be able to apply my skill in that way. And I hope that I did some good on that front as well.
How good are we at that?
There's a lot of layers of security that exist out there. And, with all of the layers of security that exist out there, I think you've seen a great deal of success in our ability to thwart the enemy from attacking us. Now, that's not to say it hasn't happened. Since 9/11, we've seen other attacks. We saw the Boston Marathon bombing, and we saw, Major Nidal Hassan in Fort Hood, Texas, and we saw the Chattanooga recruiting station, and San Bernardino, and, all of these other incidents between here and there. So it's something that nobody should ever be under the illusion of that we can protect ourselves from completely, because we can't. But we do have a very good system when layered upon each other, all the different parts of it. It is very effective.
You also spent some time affiliated with the Israeli Defense Forces. How
I
did
did.
that come about?
It's one of the things that I say most proudly. I've had the honor to serve alongside defenders of two countries. I served alongside the defenders of the United States of America. I served alongside the defenders of Israel, and that came about when I was part of my preparation for running for office was that I wanted to finish my degree. I'd never finished my degree to that point, so I started attending classes at Harvard University, and one summer while I was up there, summer of 2015, that was the summer of a recent Gaza war that was going on, Operation Protective Edge. And while I was up there, I encountered in an area that we would take my kids to go out and play, I encountered some anti-Israel protesters that were out there one night. They were protesting Israel, it's another conversation, something I didn't agree with to begin with. I thought it was very hypocritical. But as I was out there, ignoring these people, they were not ignoring me or my family. They were harassing my family and I. We had two sons at that point now, and my wife was pregnant with our third, our little girl, and they're harassing me for being a veteran, for being a service member. To which I tell people I wasn't wearing a uniform and I was retired at that point, but it's usually pretty obvious to most people. I usually wear a ball cap that says Army Rangers on it, and I don't have any legs, so most people figure that out pretty quickly, and these guys did as well. And I got home that night and I told my wife, I said, I don't know what it's going to look like, but I'm going to find a way, and I'm going to go and show my support for Israel. And the reason that I wanted to do that was because the reason those protesters decided to start harassing me was, in my opinion, they recognize that what we fight for as Americans and what they fought for Israelis paralleled each other. We have common ideology in our respect for human rights for every single person, and our drive for protecting freedom and protecting democracy and liberty. And I think it was recognizing that common ideology that we share that led those protesters to, without any provocation, start harassing me as well. So I went and showed my support for Israel.
And what did that consist of?
When I was over there, there was a lot of articles that were written and news pieces that were done. I guess it was maybe out of the norm for an American service member, or maybe even especially an injured American service member, to go and serve alongside this foreign military. And so you read a lot of the articles and they might have you believe that I was carrying an Uzi through the streets of Gaza, which I would have happily done had I been given the opportunity. I wasn't given that opportunity. I was doing very logistical work, still important work. This is work that I would see being done, that has to be done here in the United States of America in support of our service members. I was working on, medical supplies and medical kit bags and making sure that they had the resources of morphine and tourniquets and things like that that had literally been used on me when I was injured on the battlefield, I was, working as a part of their supply chain to make sure that they had the things that they needed on their battlefield. And so that was the time in Israel.
So then it became time to pursue the idea of running for Congress. First of all, we started the conversation in Michigan. Now you're running for Congress in Florida. I assume you would move there following your medical retirement?
So after I got out of high school, Florida very quickly became my home of record. When you're in the military, you have something called a military home of record. And Florida was always home away from home for my family. And I think I knew when I was about as tall as a stool that I wanted to make Florida home. It's just a place that I loved. Now, being in the military, I ended up being stationed pretty much everywhere but Florida. So I didn't get to spend a lot of time there, but after I was preparing to exit the military, and my wife and I were deciding where do we want to plant roots. Now that we have the opportunity to plant roots, where do we want to go and do that? And is it one of the places we'd been stationed, or some place we'd never lived before, or where one of us grew up? And we ultimately decided to go back to where we met, which was in the southeast Florida area along the Atlantic coast.
It was an open seat, and it's a swing district. So how did you craft your message to appeal to what is a very competitive district?
I think the best thing, if I could give anybody advice about going out there and running, it would be to just simply be honest with people. And we all have a different capacity to be blunt, but be blunt and fair and honest with people, and I think they'll all respect that. I think we can all agree. None of us have time for BS. None of us want to want to experience somebody BSing us, and none of us really want to go out there and do that. So respect other people enough not to do that. Tell it to them straight, and I think in the end they'll feel like, yeah, you may not agree on every single issue, which is something we can't sit down at our Thanksgiving or Christmas table and agree with everybody sitting at that table. So we shouldn't expect that out of strangers, but we know the person's going to be honest with us. We know they're going to tell it to us straight, and I think if we get more people to go out there and approach their electorates in that way, they'll see a great deal of respect and a great deal of success. And you show that kind of respect to people, they're going to reciprocate that to you. And that's been my experience so far.
You're in a different role now, obviously, a civilian, but with your experience with the military, now that you can have some influence on perhaps spending priorities or other legislation, where do you think the military could use the most help right now?
I think one of the biggest places the military needs assistance, and this is a place that our entire federal system needs to reform itself, is the way that we go out there and we appropriate funds, that we give funds to getting the resources that our military needs or building up infrastructure in this country. The way it works, I always tell people, it'd be the equivalent of if I wanted to build a building and they approved me to build a 4-story building, but they only going to give me the funds to build the first 2 stories. And then in a couple of years, I got to go ask for the money to build the 3rd story. And then a couple of years later, I got to go ask for the money to build the 4th story. And then maybe a few years after that, I got to ask for the money to put the roof on it. And you never know what's going to happen in that process. And it can be a very frustrating process. It makes the things that we procure more expensive. It makes the programs that we try to build things and get programs off the ground, it can make them take longer. And that ultimately hurts the warfighter on the battlefield. It means that they don't have the most technically advanced resources that they could have on the battlefield. And that's very important to our U.S. military for one very specific reason. I think we've always known, largely we're not going to outnumber our enemies. Likely those that we go to war with, in the conventional sense, we're probably not going to outnumber them. But we've always been able to outwork them and outthink and out-technically advance them and out-manufacture them. And if we lose that ability to do that, we're going to be at a very strategic disadvantage.
Congressman, I know you've got to run. Thank you most of all for your service, but thank you also for being with us today.
Thanks for having me.
Florida Congressman Brian Mast. I'm Greg Columbus. This is Veterans Chronicles.